I'm Angie Berkey, and this is What She Said, a podcast about the things women talk about when we're finally telling the truth. Let's get into it. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another week and another conversation on What She Said. And if you weren't with us last week, I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode before diving into today's, because it was part one of a really great conversation that I was having with my friend Annie Browning. And in that episode, you'll learn a little bit more about our backstory and why I felt it was so important for all of you to know Annie as well. But you'll also hear us talking about conscious leadership and the narrowing of our attention span these days. And also intentional solitude, not simply as rest or self-care, but as a way of slowing down and becoming more discerning about all the information that we are taking in. And those ideas are a bit of a bridge for what we're going to jump into today with part two. So in part two, we're asking what it means to maintain our sovereignty in an age of AI. And I share honestly about the ways in which I'm using AI, but also ways in which I have at times kind of started to outsource some of that sovereignty and the importance of recalibrating and getting that back. Annie also invites us to consider what is uniquely human, not merely which skills a machine can't yet produce, but which human qualities we want to deepen and protect. And then we take a final turn into exploring the ideas of the masculine and the feminine, not simply as men and women, but these parts that we all contain within ourselves of the masculine and the feminine. And we talk about the importance of intuition and embodied wisdom and anger, the kind of feminine rage that might actually be necessary to dismantle systems and beliefs that are no longer true or life-giving. So, this part of the conversation is expansive and personal and maybe sometimes uncomfortable, but I think in the best way possible. And as you listen, I invite you to consider, what have you accepted as your own that might not really have belonged to you? So let's return to my conversation with Annie. With all this information now that is coming at us and that we are ingesting, if we're ingesting 6 times more than we were in the 1970s as humans, we know that a huge amount of that has, like a lot of that expansion has happened from the computer eras, but now we have AI. Yes. And we think about what we are ingesting in that regard. And so that is also very tied to what you were talking about in terms of our human sovereignty. And how are we going to reclaim our humanity in this world that is very computer generated and all of this information. And so I'd like to pivot a little bit and take your call to action on that front and then kind of pivot it into that particular topic, because I am somebody who uses AI a ton. I am using it in my work all the time. My clients know that I'm using it in my work all the time. And that's it. One of my clients is a company that's very AI forward and is coming up with their own AI products. But there is this element that we aren't consciously thinking about in terms of our human sovereignty and all of this. And I'd like you to open that topic a little bit for us.
Sure. Well, I always want to give the caveat that I am no expert on AI. And by the way, the people that tell me that they are, I always want to kind of say, I want to poke that a little bit.
Right.
I will say, though, from a consciousness perspective, which I can speak to, is a lot of the generative AI and even the agentic AI, energetically or even from a consciousness lens, it is a cacophony of voices, right? It is not a singular voice coming from a singular source per se. So that sort of cacophony of voices that's embedded in outputs is what I'm suggesting is exacerbating the consumption of, we'll call it the other, the voice of the other, that without a filtering of what is my voice, my stance, my model, who am I, it can simply sort of become this generic output through us that then does not have, I believe, what makes us so exceptional as humans. That is in no way to elevate even humans above other forms of life, potentially AI included. The jury's still out on that. But what I will say is this is an invitation to reclaim and name some qualities, really some faculties of what it means to be human that I believe are not soon to be outsourced by AI. And there's generally 6 of them that I talk about regularly in my work. And I'll just name one, for example, and then please push back and ask me to explain it in a different way. But some of it is also based on my experience. When we look at human faculties, the very fact that we are mortal, that we are going to die, is not necessarily something that's easily replicated in terms of compute or in terms of how AI may respond. For example, a lot of our decisions, especially as we get older, you and I are raising our hands here, as we get older, part of our decision making is also because we start to perceive that there's a finite amount of time left. So we will start to make decisions. We will prioritize. We will process. We will give our time and our energy and our resources, our consciousness toward different decisions and ways of being and living based on that finite time. So because AI does not have a body that is going to die, we start to equivocate the two where I believe we cannot make them one and the same, right? AI doesn't face an end.
Yeah.
AI isn't facing an end. So where does this go? I want to move it from sort of a philosophical conversation, which we could talk about for 10 podcasts, into something just more real. Like, what does it mean to actually know that one day you will die? And what does that make in terms of a difference in how you live and how you operate that cannot just be replicated by a machine? If anything, it increases, at least in my life, and I'll feel tears, the urgency to love, to make healthy self-sacrifice for the greater good of others.
Yeah.
To lean into tough decisions, to take risk, calculated risk, of course, not just any risk, but to say, wow, I do feel there is an end to my life. And how can that be something that catalyzes me for action, for boldness, for being authentic and vulnerable? Because that is not something that we can just try to replicate easily in a machine. And that is unique. That is unique.
It is unique. And I think one of the things that makes me really wonder, because I don't just use AI in my work, I've used it for personal reasons before as well. And there are times that I have felt like it can be a helpful companion when you're trying to process something.
Yes.
But I've also seen myself get caught in a loop of outsourcing my discernment
Exactly.
to this entity, this whatever we want to call it, that has taken this amalgamation of thought, idea, whatever from others and kind of spinning that back out. And the disconnect that can happen then when you are doing that and not living an authentic human experience any longer, when you're not making your decisions from a place that is in here, from in your, and for those who are not watching, I'm pointing to my body, from my head, from my heart, from my gut. You know, if I'm not orienting myself within myself and making a decision for myself from that place, yet instead I'm putting it into this computer chat and having it spit out what it would recommend me to do based on what it knows from others, right? And it just, I just fear how much that is happening now and how many conversations are being had by copying and pasting text that AI gave you to a loved one and then back and forth that way. Like, this is how you should answer that question, right? And like those types of things, and rather really tuning back into your own internal intelligence. And so I don't know, I guess I'm just thinking about how disintegrated our human relationships can become too when we stop tapping into what's internal for us and outsourcing it.
Yeah, and I think you're naming, when you're pointing to your body, I mean, the body is always going to be such a good check for us on where we have outsourced. I don't say too much, because I do think there's always going to be a range for different individuals. Like, I've seen many creators or thought leaders come up with lists of do's and don'ts for how to interact with AI. And I find that conversation to be helpful to a degree. And I'll also say your body is going to give you those very visceral cues about when there's an outsourcing of you and really it's your sovereignty that has taken it to a place in which you can no longer retain and stand on the authenticity of who you are. And that may look slightly different for different people depending on how they're using AI. I just don't always find prescribed lists that are then generalized to be the most helpful way to approach some of these conversations, also because the target continues to move. I'm in the field of psychology, and I've watched a bunch of online forums sometimes among just different clinicians and providers saying, well, because we sit with people, right? Face to face, body to body, we're picking up on cues, all of that our jobs are protected. And all I find that it's just building a very convenient fence to create that illusion of security and control and safety that I find that conversation to be a little bit, I would say disingenuous, but after a while, it's just, so when the needle moves another layer and all this AI does this, we just have to build a bigger fence. So rather, I would love to just, my focus has been less on how do we focus on skills that could never be outsourced, knowing that in a month from now, maybe that conversation would be different, to what are core faculties of what it means to be human?
Yeah.
That are uniquely to what does it mean to be human, which of course gets into some of my favorite questions in the universe. Like, what makes us human? What is the meaning to be human? Again, that would take 20 podcasts, Angie.
Oh, so don't ask. I was like,
no,
do we have an answer for us here?
Not in 3 minutes. But I would say I think we can use descriptions to start to describe what are the qualities of humans that isn't just a mental exercise, but one that moves us in our hearts and our bodies. Those are the conversations I really love to have.
Yeah. So what this is kind of bringing me to is a lot of the way that you're talking about this and approaching these questions around AI, consciousness within the world, tuning back into ourselves. A lot of this is oriented around, or is sounding to me like it is helping us to think about amplifying what you and I think would call our feminine traits and leaning more into our feminine intuition. But before we start to talk about this and talk about this piece that we both have in common in terms of the work that we want to be doing and what we think is on the rise here, I'd like to hear you break down for listeners a little bit of when I'm talking about feminine traits that seem to be needing to be watered and cultivated and more in the front and center of things versus masculine. Talk about that, because we're not talking about men and women. We're talking about the feminine and the masculine. And don't worry, listeners, this is not getting ready to turn into any sort of bashing of either or.
No.
This is just, we want to talk a little bit about those two polarities and then talk a little bit about what we see coming and what is needed in the world in the coming years in terms of cultivating that rise of the feminine.
Sure. I love the question. Maybe a helpful frame, because we can look at the feminine and the masculine through so many different frameworks, but a helpful frame might just be to think about your left and right hemisphere, which, by the way, is not so simple. Like, you have two hemispheres in the brain. They are working together all the time. We have access to both. But the greatest example I might reference would be, Ian McGilchrist's work, where he talks about that the right hemisphere is more of what we would call the master, and that the left hemisphere is more of what we call an emissary. And we often reverse the two, right? So part of, I would say, the divine feminine, or just the feminine expression at any level right now in the world, is reaccessing, because it's always been there, these ways of knowing that are often very embodied,
Mm-hmm.
They're often more what we would call tacit. So they live in the layers of our subconscious and our unconscious. They're ready to
Mm-hmm.
start to be known and accessed. And they're not going to come through very linear, logical ways of kind of thinking ourselves there. So part of what you hear in my invitation is to notice where there are ways, again, sort of ways of knowing and being that are inherently feminine, and how you can use the logic and the linear sequencing of more of the left way of thought.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is categorical, to start to interpret what your lived experience is. Like what you notice, what you feel, what you intuit, what you sense, what you perceive on a daily basis, and letting that wealth of information be there and just take it in, and then let more of the classically left, logical, masculine
Mm-hmm.
ways of perceiving start to make sense of all of that information
Yeah.
that you are taking in from the feminine. So to go back to where we started, when we talk about perception, I always ask, what is being perceived? What are
Mm-hmm.
you perceiving, right? And
Yeah.
what kinds of information are you actually taking in?
Right.
And this is an opportunity for the feminine to start to take in the kinds of information that we generally have perhaps ignored or discounted
Mm-hmm.
or categorized as being invalid. I'll give you a really concrete example. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what information is coming to you through your dreams,
Mm-hmm.
right? And not just your night sleeping dreams, like
Right.
your daydreams, the
Yeah.
times where you let your imagination just wander, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of information. That's the kind of perception that I would say the rise of the feminine in the world is wanting to pay attention to and not discount.
Yeah. Not discount it. Yeah. It feels so refreshing to allow ourselves to give voice to those things, or to actually let it run more wild, right? Whether it be our
Mhm.
imagination or our hearts or things like that. And I think also, though, like that is very true. I think we want to give rise to more of that, and we want to lean into that and not discount it.
Mhm.
And also, we've talked a bit about the feminine isn't just soft. There is some answering that has to be done for. There is some calling out that needs to be had and done. And there are some systems that are needing to be dismantled that are no longer serving, right? And
Mhm.
whether they ever did or not is not what we're going to be talking about in this particular
Mhm.
conversation. But there is also kind of a reckoning that feels like it's on the horizon because of how much discounting has been done,
Mhm.
with this feminine part that exists within all of us, right?
Mhm.
And so I don't know how much you would want to talk a little bit more about, some of those systems and things that need to be more dismantled and shifted and changed. But I think all of the things we're talking about today in terms of AI and intentionality and solitude and all of these things all go together to work toward, a
Mhm.
different future that we are needing to be
Yeah.
working toward at this time.
Mhm. Yeah. So what I'll say is primarily like my own intuition and my own just prescience about what I perceive kind of stirring in the world right now. So just know that that's what I'm speaking from. I experience regularly, especially in the feminine, present in no matter what gender, just present, the feminine in the world, that there is a tremendous amount of rage that is
Hmm.
starting to emerge, right? And
Hmm.
rage is different than anger. There is, I believe, a divine rage that wants to consume and devour. You can think of it like a fire.
Hmm.
Consume and devour anything that is of illusion. And what I mean
Mm.
by illusion, it's the things that we have swallowed whole and said that they are ours, and they are not. So
Hmm.
there's almost a purification process that I feel right now happening that is necessary to dismantle many of the systems that we have said yes to, some of them by our own volition, and others simply because it's part of being living in this world, right?
Hmm.
But I do think it is part of that inner and outer rage that will start to dismantle some of those systems. And I would say at a basic level, it begins, and I say this directly, often to the feminine in us that tends to resist and avoid anything that feels like anger and
Mm.
anything that feels uncomfortable and
Mm-hmm.
itchy on the inside. And it can sometimes manifest as disappointment, irritation, frustration. And, we tend to distance ourselves in general,
Mm-hmm.
all of us, from those sorts of emotions where
Mm-hmm.
it often feels like a simmering pot of water in each of us and then in our world that is ready to start to boil.
Yeah.
And that can be
Mm-hmm.
really cathartic to start to dismantle at a base level just it's not working anymore.
Yeah. I find that really interesting because I was doing some just inner work, some self work a couple of
Mm-hmm.
weeks ago. I'm working through a workbook with a group of women that we kind of walk through how we're trying to dismantle really kind of unhealthy patterns in our own lives, whether it
Mm-hmm.
be of people pleasing, codependence, things like that. And we were talking about the inability of people, not just women, but people sometimes when they've had traumatic things happen in their lives or whatever, to identify feelings that they are
Mm-hmm.
having and to name that feeling and to figure out in their body where that feeling comes up and whatever. And so one of the questions in the workbook was, of all these feelings, and it listed a bunch of different things, what are the ones that you do not feel comfortable naming, expressing, things like that? One of the ones that was for me was anger. And I was really surprised by that because I've done so much work, Annie. I thought
I
I thought
know.
I had arrived.
By the way, everything I'm talking about, like I'm checking my name next to the list of like
Right.
things that Annie's working on, right?
But I've done a lot of my work alongside of you and with
Yeah,
you and
yeah.
all of that stuff. And we think at some point that we get to this place where I don't think I've arrived and I don't think I ever will arrive. But I was really surprised to learn that I still have a lot of discomfort
Mm-hmm.
naming anger and addressing it directly with somebody that is in an experience with me. Because it's
Yeah.
not always at myself. Sometimes it is at another human or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so interesting that that is still the case for me. And I think when I think that of what you just said of how like universally, it shouldn't surprise me that that's hard for me because it's hard for many of us. And it's so interesting. Like until we
Mm-hmm.
can get a little bit more comfortable with that, we can't have a healthy relationship with expressing those feelings
Yeah.
and doing this work of dismantling things that are not really serving us.
Yes. Yes. And we are definitely socialized and conditioned, especially classically, um, for just how the feminine has appeared, especially in Western societies, where that has not always been an acceptable emotion. And so I do think there's something, of course, what we have separated ourselves from, what we have
Mm-hmm.
kind of stored in the unconscious, I
Mm-hmm.
think is definitely starting to come forward right now. And I believe it's going to be a powerful mechanism to
Yeah.
start to dismantle many of the structures that we, quite frankly, we don't have a high level of trust in them anymore.
Hmm.
We tend to look for safety and security in other forms right now than some of the structures and systems that classically have been where we would have found that
Right.
allegiance.
Right.
And I guess my invitation is to let yourself be angry about that. You, me, and all of us who are listening.
Let those uncomfortable feelings fly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And sit with them.
Mm-hmm.
You're giving us so much to think about. And I'd really encourage all of us, myself included, to take a lot of the topics that we're thinking about here today and spend a little bit more time. If it's a 2-to-1 ratio, this
Mm-hmm.
conversation is lasting towards an hour here. So we've got a couple hours of processing to do to think through all this because I don't know. I just think the benefit that we all experience when we do slow down and when we really allow something to sit with us and to sink in and to really take shape within us in a different way. I don't know. It's very life-changing and it's so simple but it's still so difficult to allow ourselves to do that, to give ourselves permission to really, again, sit in solitude and in silence and to
Mm-hmm.
just be with our thoughts and to think through what we feel and think and
Mm-hmm.
believe and all of those things. So, in our conversation, I feel like there's a lot of call to action today, if people so choose. But I just want to thank you. Thank you for bringing all these topics to the forefront in the work that you're doing and in the conversations
Mm-hmm.
that you're having in the world. It's really meaningful, and it really does give us a little bit more permission to hit that pause button, that slow button, instead of listening to something in 2x. Maybe we could listen to it in 0.5 and really allow
Yeah.
it to sink in a little bit more and not just hit next on the queue in our podcast feed to just like keep ingesting more and more and more right after the next one.
Well, and to choose, I think this is where, we call it like signal versus noise,
Mm-hmm.
to be selective in what you consume, right?
Yeah.
Let that podcast, like this one, be really worth the hour
Right.
of ingestion, so that those 2 hours of digestion are not just about the podcast, but it's actually just listening to yourself. And
Yeah.
I'll just say one more thing. I find it interesting that the pace and the rate of change right now has set a particular time. Our sense of time has begun to change, right? So
Mm-hmm.
even that idea of, I think all of us, if we're honest, if I don't continue to consume, I'm going to get left behind
Mm.
and I won't be able to keep up and I won't be relevant. I mean, you can follow the logic tree here of
Yeah.
around, like, it hits at some of our core fears.
Right.
And I believe wholeheartedly, not just in my mind, but in every ounce of my being, that as quickly as the world goes, our capacity to think slowly, deliberately, in a holistic way,
Mm-hmm.
in not just our minds, but with our bodies,
Mm-hmm.
that is going to be what gives us, we could call it that competitive edge. So it's
Mm.
counterintuitive. It's almost like the slower you go,
Yeah.
perhaps the further you will be.
Yeah. I think that's the perfect place to end things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we will make sure, Annie, to put in the show notes where people can find you, whether it be on social media or your
Sure.
website, things like that, because I want people to know how they can connect in with you. But mostly, I just want to thank you as my friend for taking the
Of
time
course.
out of your busy day and your busy family life to sit with us and to have this very intentional conversation. And I can't wait to do it again sometime.
Yes. Thank you, Angie. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here this week. And I'll see you soon, real soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. If today's conversation stayed with you, share it with someone you love or leave us a review. And if it sparked a story of your own, I'd love to hear from you. I'll see you next time on What She Said.